Right now that we have clarified some basic terminology, we are going to start talking about human development. What have we learned about human development from developmental psychology and related fields? Well, we have to start at the beginning. When does development begin? Do you remember from our previous video? It's a lifespan approach, womb to tomb psychology. So we have to go all the way to the beginning to conception. So what is conception? I do find that some students are kind of honest with me and they'll say, I'm not entirely sure what that word means. Can you help me out? Conception is when you have fertilization of an ovum, or an egg as we often call it, by a sperm, or it's when a pregnancy begins, essentially. Now, you would not be able to detect that pregnancy yet. If you took a pregnancy test, it would still be negative. If you did an ultrasound, you wouldn't be able to see anything. But you've got a new individual in there, in the host, the person who, well, not necessarily the person who produced that ovum. They could have a donor ovum, but that individual that has a zygote. I'm overthinking it because I know too much about this field. I'm like, you could also have IVF. This could happen outside the body. But let's say it's an in vivo pregnancy, happens inside the body. You've got that zygote. A zygote is an individual that has typically 46 chromosomes. You get 23 chromosomes from that sperm, 23 chromosomes from that ovum, and then you get a new individual that has chromosomes that are contributed from each of the biological parents. So the one that produced the sperm, the one that produced the ovum. All right, so pregnancy has begun. We're ready to start developing. What's involved in a pregnancy? What are the stages of development? When the individual is still in an intrauterine environment. All right. When I ask students, hey, what are the stages of pregnancy? Or we say stages of prenatal development. Sometimes students are like, oh, I know, the 3 trimesters. And sometimes these are students, they say, I've had a baby, I know all about this. I say, well, actually, when you go to the doctor, they do things a little bit differently. They just take a pregnancy. And by the way, if you're curious, a typical pregnancy lasts 40 weeks from the first day of a person's last menstrual period. I thought it's supposed to be 9 months, right? If you round approximately, but actually, if you want to be precise, your typical, when they calculate a due date, when they calculate someone's due date, they just take the first day, the last menstrual period, and they add 40 weeks. All right, and then they take it and they break it up into the 3 equal parts, and you have the first trimester, second trimester, third trimester. Okay, in developmental science, we do it a little differently. All right, we do it based on which events are happening. So we don't just break it up into 3 equal parts. We distinguish different stages of prenatal development based on the different events, qualitatively different events. You might even say discontinuity in the sort of stuff that's going on during prenatal development. All right, so we do have 3 still, all right? So there are 3 trimesters. There are 3 stages of prenatal development. They are not equal in size at all. One is way longer than the others. All right, so those 3 stages, the germinal period, the embryonic period, and the fetal period. The shortest is the germinal period, and the longest by far is the fetal period. All right, so what are the difference between those? All right, some basic differences. Germinal stage, germinal period or germinal stage. You have essentially, you have a single cell when it's a zygote. It starts to expand and have multiple cells, but you've got kind of a ball of cells at that point. And I don't use that terminology to be like dismissive of that individual. It's simply that sometimes I have students, they immediately think baby. And I'm like, well, no, we go through all of these vulnerable stages first until we get to that point where you can look at, say, an ultrasound and say, oh, look, I can see what that individual looks like. Now, this is a very vulnerable time. And if you know anything about the reproductive system, and if you don't and you want to do more, I do go into more detail in other classes, my other developmental psychology classes that I teach. But that zygote, as it's expanding and going into other stages, it has to travel into the uterus. All right, the uterus, in common language, also known as the womb. The uterus is where you want something called implantation to happen. That is where that individual actually becomes connected to the person who is pregnant. Up until then, the reason you can't get a positive pregnancy test before then is because there's no connection. It's just sort of sitting in there. And so that happens around 10 days after conception. You have implantation, if it's successful. One complicating issue that I talk about more in other classes is that it often isn't just pregnancy. Pregnancy is complicated. Oversimplified statement right there. So when you get to the point of implantation, I'm checking the book. Okay, the book does not give the term for the label at that point, so I'm not going to throw that at you. All right, but implantation, you actually get the connection. All right, so there's a lot of really tiny, delicate cellular duplication going on during the germinal period. Once implantation has happened, you can actually detect the pregnancy with a pregnancy test. You're still not going to get much with an ultrasound, just too small, too tiny at this point. Now, when you get to the embryonic stage, the embryonic stage goes from about week 3 to about week, I want to say 9 after conception, but it's the middle period, and it's the middle in terms of length of the prenatal period. So when you have the embryonic period, you now have an embryo. All right, you actually do call it an embryo then. When I see news coverage of pregnancy-related issues, they use these terms with less precision than like a textbook would. All right, so your embryo, you start to have differentiation. You have a clear head region, a clear tail region. You start to see what are going to be arms and legs, even though they kind of look like flippers at first. And important organs form. Organ structures start to form, and that's really an essential part of the embryonic period. And so the first sign of organ function that you can detect is when something called the heart plate starts to flicker. I'm being hesitant to call it a heartbeat because it's not a 4-chambered heart yet, but you can, on an ultrasound, you can see this little flickering that shows that, hey, there's activity. That's an organ system. The cardiovascular system is showing activity. That happens during the embryonic period. You also have the skeletal system. The skin, a lot of people don't think of the skin as an organ, but the major organs are like put into place. They're not ready yet. They still have a lot of developing, a lot of growing ahead of them. And another big important thing that happens during the embryonic period, the brain. The brain's not formed yet, but something called the neural tube is eventually going to become the brain and spinal cord. By the way, sometimes things go wrong with the development of the neural tube. You can have neural tube defects. A good way to prevent neural tube defects is to take folic acid before getting pregnant. So anyone who's capable of becoming pregnant, it's often recommended that they get folic acid into their system because it's an effective, it's associated with reduced risk of neural tube defects, but only if you take it before getting pregnant. All right, folic acid, good stuff. Now, after the embryonic period, you've got the fetal period. The fetal period is a good chunk of a healthy full-term pregnancy. What happens during the fetal period? Things get bigger. So a major thing that happens is you get growth. You get things getting bigger, and the fetal period ends when the delivery happens, when the pregnancy ends. At some point during the fetal period, it becomes possible to look at an ultrasound and determine the genital sex of the infant. Notice I said genital sex because a lot of times people don't realize sex. By the way, sex is different than gender. I'll cover that differently, different time. But gender is identity. It's a social construct. But sex, biological sex, like classifying someone as male or female, that's actually, there are 3 determinants. 3 determinants of sex. You have chromosomal sex, hormonal sex, and genital or reproductive system sex. And so that's so you can see their genital sex. You can see what they have there. By the way, when someone has a gender reveal party, technically it's a genital sex reveal party for most individuals. Hey, that doesn't mean you can't have the cupcakes and have fun at one of the parties. All right, so the fetal period lasts a long time. There's a lot of growth that happens during the fetal period. Now, another thing, let me just check on here. Checking in my book, trying to make sure I don't give you too much extra stuff. All right, so those are your three stages. Now, I'm noticing my book had the fetal stage starting around 8 weeks. I think the book, yeah, your book is doing it a little different. I learned 3 to 9 weeks. All right, your book says 8 weeks. So obviously, since I'm saying it with some inconsistency, I'm not going to give you a test question where you're going to have to know exactly when. But the fetal period, it lasts the longest. Think growth. All right, so germinal period, think cellular duplication. Embryonic period, organ growth. Organ formation is a better word. Organ formation. Fetal period, getting bigger, getting ready for the world. All right, so that's your basic rundown of the 3 periods of prenatal development. I'll give you some more information about important topics during pregnancy and prenatal development in the next video.